Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Wayne. We're with Anadaic Judith doing another episode program, Voices for the Future, our last program for the year. And we have as our guest, Bill Ayers. Bill is kind enough to be willing to be a guest, and he's in Chicago. So I will read your biography and then we'll kick it off. So Bill Ayres is a distinguished professor of education and senior university scholar at the University of Chicago, or University of Illinois, Chicago, retired, and has written extensively about social justice and democracy, education, and the cultural context of schooling and teaching as its essentially intellectual, ethical, and political enterprise. He's written at least 15 books, including A Kind and Just Parent, Teaching Toward Freedom, Fugitive Days, a Memoir, Public Enemy, Confessions of an American Dissident, On the Side of the Child, To Teach, The Journey in Comics, and one of his most recent books, Demand the Impossible. So welcome, Bill. It's an honor. It's a great privilege to have you. As a kid, I knew your exploits, and it's great that you've kept on going. And
well, the honor is mine, and it's true. I had exploits 60 years ago, but I'm still having exploits. So that's the important thing.
Yeah.
You know, I always get nervous, Michael, when people of my generation or even younger are nostalgic for a ship that already left the shore. I am not nostalgic in that way at all. I mean, I did live many exciting moments, but the most exciting is right now looking forward. You call this Voices of the Future. And the point is that whatever happened before was prelude. And anyone who's living their life kind of longing for the 60s, I feel is a little bit in need of a kickstart into the movement today, because the movement is happening. It never isn't happening. So we have a responsibility. Those of us who believe in freedom have a responsibility to nourish our freedom dreams and to get up every morning deciding that we're going to commit to those dreams again, and we're going to get started again. And sure, I mean, I have a kind of a dialectic I try to follow. I go to bed each night critical of what we didn't do, worrying about what is still to be done, and I wake up every morning hopeful that today is the day we will fill in the blank, overthrow capitalism and war, create a scene of peace and justice. But that's what I live for. That's what we've lived for Bernadine and I, for our 55 years together.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That's so inspiring, because so many people feel like the 60s were a failure, that the vision that we had at that time just got plowed under and fizzled. And I feel like you did, that it never died.
Well, it never dies, actually. I mean, when you say a failure, it's complicated, because I think there's another group of people from that generation or younger who say, it was all great in the 60s. We did it all in the 60s. And that's also not true. They say we had the greatest music, the greatest demonstrations, the greatest, sex and everything else. And the fact is that it's all great today. And the largest anti-war movement day I ever participated in was the first Iraq War. The largest demonstration against racial injustice in this country was after the murder of George Floyd. 26 million people in the streets. So you can kind of romanticize the past, but it's a mistake. I often think these are the worst of times. We have a proxy war in Europe. We have a Cold War in Asia. We have an announced genocide in the Middle East. We have women's bodies under continued assault by the state, and on and on. We have environmental collapse happening all around us. So it's the worst of times. But other times I feel like, well, we had the largest outpouring for racial justice ever after George Floyd. Kids everywhere are not accepting the idea that catastrophic climate collapse is inevitable. They're not accepting it. Women are not, of all political stripes, are not going back into a medieval definition of themselves. They're striking back. So I think Charles Dickens would understand us perfectly. It's the worst of times, it's the best of times. In other words, it's a time like every other time. And our job is to make a concrete analysis of what we see before us, and then get busy in projects of repair, reconciliation, revolution. And that's what we should do every day. One other word on the question of failure. I always love this dialectic that Samuel Beckett has said several times, but he first said it in a short story called Westward Ho. And the phrase is try, fail, try again, fail better. And it's not like we're going to get to where we need to go, but you have to keep trying. And there's no circumstance, when anybody describes to me the dismal hand they've been dealt, the dismal administration or the dismal boss or the dismal city government. And if I say, okay, I accept that your definition of how bad it is true, then the question is, what are 5 things we're going to do, given that analysis of the situation? It's never the case that there's nothing to do. There's always something to do. So yes, failure, success, let's get a different definition of what it means to succeed.
Yeah. So before we go further with that, you talked about the 60s, and I want to trace kind of the yin and yang of the 60s and also tie it into the University of Illinois, Chicago, I believe. Milton Friedman, who was at your university. Is that
well,
true?
you've when you started to introduce me, you said you started to say University of Chicago. That is Milton Friedman's university. And in fact, the whole school of economics that won all those Nobel Prizes, they're all part of that Friedman School of Economics. That's the University of Chicago. I was going to correct you, but you corrected yourself, because I'm at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm at a public school. I do not want to be compared to that lofty private school on the South Side. I'd rather be where I am.
Yeah, but yeah, thanks for the correction. But what I wanted to trace was that Milton Friedman he was pretty shrewd in marketing, because he used really flowery language to appeal to the 1960s generation in selling his economic approach, that it's all about freedom. I think it was Free to Be, something like that was his 10-part series on PBS, and the introduction to his supply side economics. So it's it was a very shrewd thing, and really the beginning of the dark side taking over, Friedman into Reaganomics and neoliberalism, and where we are today.
Well, Friedman was the champion of neoliberalism, and in a very simple way to understand that is, it's no government control, no regulation, the free market cut loose to free itself. And the interesting thing that you raised that, Michael, is that the word freedom is practically appliqued on our American minds. We see it everywhere. There's the Black Freedom Movement, which is my world, the world I endorse and believe in. And then there's the Freedom Unlimited Visa card, and there's the Courage to Be Free by the deplorable Ron DeSantis, and there's Milton Friedman with the free market run amok. The reality is that freedom can mean many, many things. Joe Biden said yesterday that if we didn't give billions more to Ukraine, we were against freedom. So it has so many nuances and meanings. And that's why I wrote a whole book about it, which is coming out this fall, called When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer. And what I try to do in that book is to talk a bit about different visions of freedom. One being the Milton Friedman vision, the idea that we are ensnared in kind of toxic individualism, that we're each a boat on our own bottom. We have no mutual concerns. There is no collective, or as Margaret Thatcher said, another champion of this idea, there is no such thing as society. We don't want to believe in society. Ronald Reagan, government isn't the solution to the problems, government is the problem. And those pillars create a situation where the definition of freedom is freedom to extract, freedom to exploit, freedom to rape and pillage, freedom to conquer, freedom to occupy, freedom to kill. And James Bond, license to kill. On the other side, there's a notion of freedom that's got to do with mutual aid, with mutual care, with the realization that we are all in this together, and that you can't go down the road all by yourself and expect to get anything that would resemble the kind of life we would all like to live. And it gets to absurd dimensions. We heard a guy on the radio the other day, a politician from, I believe, Tampa, who said, look, the environmental crisis isn't a collective problem, it's an individual problem. Now, that is just, he's out of his mind right there. He went on to say, Miami and Tampa face different problems, so we should solve our problems with different answers. And I'm thinking to myself, well, good luck, Miami. If you're cut loose to solve the environmental crisis by yourself. The reality is we are not only in this together, but that we need to find ways to not only connect, but to act arm in arm, heart to heart, with a common purpose to make life more livable, more free, more humane for all human beings. And anything less than that is a kind of selective humanization. That is, some people are better than others. Who, I often do little kind of prompts with my students, and one of my prompts recently in my ethics class was, everyone deserves it was agree or disagree. Everyone deserves everything they need to live a life of dignity. And it just caused pandemonium in my ethics class because, wait, what? Everyone? I don't know about everyone. Well, who doesn't deserve what they need to live a life of dignity? Well, you begin to get into that, chopping it up and saying some humans are more worthy than other humans. That's a dangerous, slippery, and ultimately a racist and exploitative approach.
Well, in some ways, when you say climate change is an individual problem, what's true about that is the emphasis on individualism over what's good for the collective and what's good for the environment is at the root of the problem.
Well, that's true. I agree with you on that. And I think we have to challenge the idea that the problem can be solved one by one by one. It is a problem. It's human created climate change is what we're talking about, or sometimes they call it catastrophic capitalistic climate collapse. I like the sound of that, CCCC.
Yeah,
but the reality is, so here's the problem with the individual. I mean, you're right when you put it that way. We get into this mess because everyone's an individual, consume. Yeah. But the problem is that, for example, I heard a very smart, wonderful environmentalist on the radio a month or so ago talking about the ocean and explaining that the ocean is not infinite. Now, that's a very important thing for us to understand. The ocean's not infinite. The environment is not infinite. This little, cushion of oxygen that we have around us, that's not necessarily forever. We have to nourish it. We have to, shepherd it. So this person gave a great talk about that. The interviewer said, what can people do? And the wonderful person, environmentalist person, came up with 6 things immediately, none of them structural. All of them, you could eat lower on the food chain. You could recycle your bottles. You could do this and that. That's all true. And we should all do those things. But if you don't go to the structural heart of the matter, you end up in a kind of, again, reinforcing the idea that it's you, it's not us. And the first thing we have to get to, if we want to understand freedom in its most capacious and hopeful dimensions, we have to talk about we, not me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And speaking of the structural and climate change, right now in Dubai is the COP28, headed by Sultan Al Jaber, the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So that's just, it's mind blowing. And the oil companies are there; they're having a great time. And he said something. He said, if you're about forgot his exact word, but he said there's no science that phasing out fossil fuels.
That's what he said.
Fossil
Yeah,
fuels are not the problem.
That's
yeah,
what he said. It's like guns are not the problem, people are the problem. The
yeah,
reality is, and of course, they end up having this fight that gets trivialized in the media, but it's not a trivial fight. And the fight is that the true social justice environmentalists, the environmental justice people, want to say we need to eliminate the use of fossil fuels. That's true. The people like the head of the meeting, who's also the head of the energy monopoly, says, no, we need to phase them out. Well, that sounds like a trivial fight, and it's trivialized in the media. It's not trivial. We have to either commit to actually saving the planet by not burning fossil fuels. But again, back to your point, about individualism. One of the things that kills me, anytime I look around, I'm devastated by certain things. But it's interesting to me that in our country, there's such an emphasis on individualism that we've gotten to the point in the last 40 years where people say, if you want public health, the answer to that is stay healthy. You want public safety, own a gun. You want public schools, buy it at the marketplace. And of course, all of that is foolhardy when you look down the road, voices of the future, it's all foolhardy. But I look around, and for example, we were coming downtown tonight, and everybody's in their own little steel box, their own car, and we're all individual. We have a decimated public transportation system in this country. Nobody wants to invest in that. You often wonder, why is the post office and Amtrak the enemy of the right-wing Republicans? Well, because it represents collective, and any sniff of collective is bad by definition. But so here we are in traffic jams in our little steel boxes. And what is everybody talking about in terms of the future? People are talking about, robot-driven cars. Wait, couldn't we use all that technology, all that labor, all that wealth to create a public transportation system that would suit our needs? Fast trains, buses connected to little walkaways, and so on. We could do it. We have the technology to do it. We don't have the political will. We don't have the consciousness that could spring us from toxic individualism toward a notion of mutual problem solving.
mm-hmm.
Beautifully put. And we don't have the political will. And this is where so many people feel powerless. They think, well, I'm not a politician. I'm not up there making those decisions. What can I do? But you've spent your life, you spent your life elevating people to feel like they can do something.
Well, we have to. The truth is that a lot of what it means to be an organizer is to create the conditions where you can unlock the wisdom in the room, and ordinary people actually have the solutions to their problems. The thing you say about politics is so important. I think it was Rousseau who once said, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And if we want to see two recent examples, one example is Roe versus Wade, and the reversal of Roe v. Wade. You may have thought, I'm not political. Why would I get involved in that nonsense? Because politics is interested in you. And suddenly you wake up one day and you think, wait, I was just sitting here minding my own business, and suddenly my body has been taken away by the state, and they are going to require me to give birth, and any notion of reproductive justice is gone. Not only are they going to require me to give birth, which incidentally in this country we have a great tradition of, and that tradition is slavery. The state required women to have babies. And the second part of that, which is still true, is not only can we require you to have a baby, but then we can take that baby away if we think you're unfit. And the stealing of babies is another thing that goes on in communities here in Chicago all the time. So we have to say, okay, you may not be interested in politics. Let me tell you why you should be, why you ought to be. And the other killer example we've already talked about, and that is the environment. I'm not interested in politics. When you can't breathe because of fires coming from Canada, you should get interested in politics.
Right. Beautifully.
Yeah.
I
So
figured-
yeah, so going back to what you were talking about just before, Bill, about the collective good, or public transportation, or free tuition, all these things that we see in Europe and a lot of the countries, but not here. And anytime there's talk about canceling student debt or expanded child tax tuition credits or anything, the S word gets thrown out: socialism. And that's akin to the devil. You had it personally. It happened to you when in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, and the Republicans threw at him, "You were a student of Bill Ayers, so therefore you are bad, you are evil, Barack Obama." And I don't know what your relationship was with him, but it just gets thrown out there. So you were personified as the devil incarnate yourself, Bill.
That's right.
Yes.
And that hasn't stopped. That's still going on. But at that, it was a particular. It reached a
that must
particular.
mean you're onto something. If it
Yeah,
hasn't
it reached
stopped.
a particular pitch in 2008. And I'll tell you a quick story about it, if I may. I had my graduate students over for a potluck, which I often do, and it happened to be the night of the last debate between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and George Stephanopoulos was the moderator, and we were having our own seminar and our own potluck, but we finished and we were cleaning up, and some political junkie turned on the TV just as Stephanopoulos said to Obama, "But what about your friend Jeremiah Wright?" And Obama answered it, and he said, he lived in a different era, and I'm not as angry as him, or whatever. And then the next question was, well, what about your friend Bill Ayers? He was a terrorist and he never apologized. What about that? And my students fell on the floor to see my name. And Obama went on to say he was a guy around the neighborhood. I don't take political advice from him, and so on. But my students were just stunned. And one of them looked up and said, "That guy has the same name as you." And one of the other students helpfully said, "They are the same guy." And that created a firestorm that has never completely subsided. But the truth is that Barack Obama and I, and Bernadine and I, and our families live very close to each other in Hyde Park. It's like a small neighborhood, a small village. And yes, I was a guy around the neighborhood. He was a guy around the neighborhood too. But we never shared a milkshake with two straws. We weren't that intimate. And certainly if he would ever take my advice, which I wish he would, we would have abolished nuclear weapons. We would have closed all the foreign military bases. We would have had universal health care, no college tuition, and I could go on. But that's because those are my politics. Anyone who knew Barack back then would have said to you, he's the smartest guy in any room he walks into. And he's an ambitious politician who, has things to do and places to go, but he's a liberal. I am not a liberal. I consider myself a radical, by which I mean, I want to go to the root of problems, not just deal with the superficial or the consequences. I want to say, if we're always in a state of war, what is the root of that? Why are we always at war? It's not like when I started off as a student, I wanted to end the war in Vietnam. And as the war pressed on, I began to realize with my comrades, my friends, that there was a root to this, that there was always a war. It wasn't just the war in Vietnam we wanted to end. We wanted to end the cause of war. And so we didn't succeed in that, but also success is a tricky business. We learned a lot. And frankly, again, going back a ways, my standard for how we evaluate our work is always a pedagogical standard. That is, when we go out into a demonstration, or we go on a knock on door campaign, or we go out to petition, the question we should always ask ourselves is, did I teach and did I learn? If I learned and I taught, then the action was okay. If I didn't learn and I didn't teach, but I simply posed and postured and signaled my virtuousness. No, that's not a worthy standard. So I think that it's easy to say, and I will say it, it's easy to say what the responsibility of an organizer or an educator, or frankly, a moral citizen. The responsibility is easy to say and excruciatingly difficult to enact. The rhythm is this: you have to open your eyes. You can't understand the world if you don't pay attention, open your eyes, not once, not twice, but every day in every way. And then you have to be astonished. You have to be astonished at both the beauty and the ecstasy in every direction, and also astonished at the terrible, terrible things that we visit upon one another. And you need to be angry about it. Third, you need to act. You need to do something. And that something is not prescribed. You need to choose with your friends to do something. And then the fourth step is you have to doubt. If there's one thing I regret from my life throughout, but certainly going back to the 60s, it's that we forgot step number 4. You have to doubt, you have to rethink, you have to recalibrate, and then you repeat. Pay attention, be astonished, act, doubt, repeat. And that to me is the rhythm of what it means to be an ethical person in this world. It's what it means to be a good organizer or a good teacher.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, you talk about being a radical and getting down to the roots of things. And so there's so many problems in the world these days. We've got this multi-systemic crises of climate change, of income inequality and racism and political corruption. And I mean, we all know the litany. And each one of them has a root, but are you seeing a common root to them all?
Absolutely,
Get down to
absolutely.
things.
Absolutely. And I think you've said it very well. So we have interlocking and escalating crises: a crisis of truth, a crisis of government, a crisis of capital, a crisis of imperialism, a crisis of militarism, crisis of white supremacy, crisis of the environment, and we could go on. And these are interlocking. And
democracy.
and the thing that my students sometimes say to me is, well, I can't do everything. And my response is, you don't have to do everything. You have to do something. And if you do something, and that includes reframing the issue in terms of justice, in terms of human rights, and then you connect the something that you do to other somethings, you come up with a larger solution. So what is underneath all of this? I would argue that it's racial capitalism and empire. And that without, we have a dismal history in this country, and it's one that we've exported and imported. And that is a history of land conquest, of theft, of genocide and attempted genocide, a tradition of selling human beings and buying human beings, exploitation, extraction. These are all things that we have to come to terms with. You can't reconcile if you don't tell the truth. So, truth and reconciliation are sequential. You have to tell the truth, you have to offer repair, and then you can reconcile. You can't reconcile without truth, can't reconcile with a lie, but nor can you reconcile if there's been no repair. So that's the rhythm of it in my mind. And I think that we need to come to terms. And I think there's so many smart people out there. Our colleague here, Barbara Ransby, Miriam Kaba, Angela Davis, Kianga Yamada Taylor. There's so many brilliant, brilliant people writing about these issues, making the connections. Robin D.G. Kelly, all of these folks are showing us a path forward. And these are all, incidentally, people who take seriously the question of studying and learning and reading, but they also take seriously the idea that being an academic without being an activist is a dead end. And these are sometimes I call them engaged intellectuals, sometimes they call them enraged intellectuals, but they are the people who can help us find our way. But like all good organizers, people I just named are all people who understand that when you're a good teacher or a good scholar, you're learning from as much as you're teaching. So you create the conditions where you're unlocking the wisdom in any room you're in, and you're learning from the people in order to be a part of something better and bigger.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, talking about capitalism, you used a phrase, Bill, that I never heard before. And I wonder if you just expound on it. In your book, Demand the Impossible, in the latter part of the book, you mentioned casino capitalism, the different phrases capitalism called, but you also said Wizard of Oz capitalism. In my mind, I'm thinking what it means, but I figured I got you here. I got the author here, the person put the phrase together, what you would say.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many ways, so many adjectives you could put in front of capitalism. I think it's very important that we emphasize racial capitalism because capitalism, it's not like that's a new thing. Capitalism, as it evolved out of the 17th, 18th century, was always based on race and exploitation. And what built up the wealth of this country was land theft and flesh theft. So that's very important. But yeah, we can talk about zombie capitalism. And frankly, young people get this immediately. They get the fact that the capitalism of today isn't so much interested in producing things, it's interested in selling, in a shell game. It's all one kind of gigantic magical thinking. And when I say Wizard of Oz capitalism, what I mean is, who is that man behind the screen, pulling the buttons and making the scary sounds? Well, it's not anything as substantive as, we might have imagined half a century ago or a century ago. It really is financialization. It's selling, it's selling futures, it's gambling. And it really is like a medieval, auction block. And I think we have to see it for what it is. It's not producing for the people we need, or for what the people need. It's producing for magnificent wealth on one hand and dire poverty on the other. You talked about income inequality. There is no way to have a democracy if a few people have so much that they can appoint themselves Commissioner of World Health or Commissioner of American Schools. And that's exactly the situation we're in. There's something wrong with our tax code if Bill Gates can name himself chief of education and everyone bows down. That's insane. What does he know about schools? What does he understand about communities? And so on. We could go on and on. But the point is that we need to see the ways in which this system is taking us on a great gaudy vision to nowhere. And it's nowhere that we want to live. I often think and reference Martin Luther King, who talked in his wonderful Beyond Vietnam speech and many other speeches. He talked about the three evils, and he talked about racism, white supremacy, he talked about militarism, aggressive military adventures everywhere, and he talked about materialism, capitalism, consumption. You cannot consume your way out of this, and it will not make you happy. It will not make the world a better place. Another thing that comes to my mind, because I'm looking out the window here in downtown Chicago at the West Side, and we have in Chicago a terrific, as we do everywhere, just a phenomenal crisis of the unhoused. And the crisis is a crisis that impacts policing, schooling, medicine, hospitals, everything. But here's the thing people should notice. The number of unhoused people in Chicago correlates almost directly the number of vacant apartments in Chicago. So what the hell is standing between those two things coming together? And we all know the answer. Wizard of Oz capitalism is standing in between. And we can't make the match that so obviously needs to be made because capitalism won't allow it. There has to be profit. There has to be market. There has to be gain for somebody and loss for somebody else. So as long as we believe that in the great kind of casino that capitalism is, that we might be a winner, that blurs us to all the things that are in front of us that we could do to create a society that's balanced, that's loving, that cares about one another in a deep way. Those things are within our reach, but they're not necessarily going to happen just because we wish they would.
Yeah.
So were you going to go?
Well, I have a quote from John Steinbeck that's very pertinent to what you were just saying, Bill. He said, socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Yeah, I would only disagree with him with one thing, which is never is a long, long time. I think that things shift dramatically, and when they do, they take our breath away. You know, the day before any social revolution or social movement, the day before, every commentator said it's impossible. The day after, it was inevitable. So I was there the day before. Rosa Parks sat in on the bus. Impossible, won't lead to anything. The day after, the great civil rights movement was inevitable. Same with women's movement, same with the queer movement. If you go back, I mean, I don't think neither of you as old as I am, but you go back even 10 years, and the idea that gay marriage would be legal and that we would be recognizing the rights of queer people is unthinkable, even a decade ago. And now it's upon us, and it's not good. That genie is not going back into the bottle. The other thing that comes to my mind when you read that quote from Steinbeck is that I believe it was Bakunin, the great anarchist socialist, the kind of father of anarchist socialism, who said, socialism without freedom is barbarity and exploitation, but freedom without socialism is absolute dictatorial chaos and extraction and exploitation. I mean, what we really need is to promote and build on the idea that we need both freedom and collectivity. Those are the things that we need. We need to find a way to marry those things.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom and responsibility, you know.
Well, the responsibility, but really, it's seeing ourselves in others. It's not possible. I mean, you know, the idea that we're all individuals is tempting, and it's so promoted in America that we get lost in it. But the reality is, and there's a wonderful book by a philosopher in England named Norman Garros, and the book is called The Contract of Mutual Indifference, and the subtitle is Political Philosophy After the Holocaust. And he does a deep dive into every memoir and every fictional account of the Holocaust in Europe. And he points out that what we've created is a culture and an ethics that says, I'm not going to care about you. I'm not going to take care of you. And there's a hidden assumption that makes us all feel precarious and terrified, which is, I guess you're not going to take care of me either. And so we see the gutting of the public square, the gutting of any notion of mutual aid and care. So we don't want to fund universal health care. That would, and a lot of the motive for that is age-old white supremacy. Why should I pay taxes for your kids? You know, why do I want to build good schools in Chicago? I don't have a kid in the schools. And that's that kind of hyper-individualism. But yet, and this is the interesting thing, and we need to find ways to build the bridge around this. And yet, when I get in a motorcycle accident, I not only want a hospital near at hand, I want it to be well staffed, I want it to be well provisioned. You know, I want the hospital there for me, but I'm not willing to pay for it for you. And that's the American contract that is blowing up on us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the crux of where we are in evolution right now. We've been in this individualism, right. And to see that we can put ourselves together and create a common vision for what will actually benefit everyone.
That's right.
When we look at it as a whole and hold it all together.
Well, it's important. What you're saying is very important, because it would be better. Here's what's interesting. We can take a lot of cuts on this, but let's try it this way. When women are free, men will be free. And what will be we free from or free with? We will be free from the precarity of the falseness of male supremacy and the ridiculousness of defending our little, our little bits and crumbs. And that's true for whites and blacks. James Baldwin said, when the slave frees itself, they also free the slave masters. So when Black people are free, white people are free. Free of what? Free of the precariousness of being a white person, and knowing that payback's going to come, but I hope not soon, and that kind of insanity. So I think we're talking about trying to build a world that's balanced, that's safe, that's that is good for all. And good for all means good for each.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Full vision. That's the kind of vision we want on Voices for the Future.
Absolutely.
If people go to a building site and there's a blueprint of what to build, the workers know what to do with the wood and the nails and the glass. But if there's no blueprint, common vision of what we are building together, then people don't know what to do. And instead they go into that me, mine, I'll take this lumber home to my house.
Yeah.
And nothing gets built.
But of course, that blueprint has to be built by all of us. And, I'm thinking of a conversation I had with Edward Galeano, the great Uruguayan writer, wrote Open Veins in Latin America. And somebody accused him of being a utopian. And he said, I guess that's true. And the person said, what good is utopia? And Galeano said, well, it's true. If I take 3 steps towards utopia, utopia takes 3 steps away from me. If I take 10 steps towards utopia, utopia moves 10 steps away from me. So what good is utopia? And his answer, it's good for walking. It's good for walking. And projecting a North Star, projecting a vision of what we're trying to reach is important so we don't completely go off the rails. One of the things people forget is during the fighting of the South Africa against apartheid, the ANC would often call retreats. They would call a retreat where they would all get all the cadre and just go backwards and sit and talk with one another for a week or 10 days. And some of the militants would criticize them and say, well, that's just a waste of time. We're in the middle of a war. And the ANC militants, the leaders, would argue, if we don't work together to think of what we're fighting for, then we're going to end up making mistakes that will undermine the struggle in the present tense, but it'll also undermine the future. If you want to know what we're fighting for, let's spend some time on that. Not that we can give you a blueprint, but we can continue to work on the idea. And through the struggle, the idea will expand. Think for a minute about the civil rights movement. When the kids sat in on the buses, when they sat in at the lunch counters, for real, in the early days, what they wanted was a seat at the lunch counter. But the longer it went on, the more the vision of what was possible expanded. Then they didn't want a seat at the lunch counter. They asked themselves, do I want to get into a society like this, or do I want to build the society in which my humanity would not be a question? And that's the kind of expansion of the vision that I think we all need to participate in.
And that lifts all boats.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we're in this together, and we're in the struggle together. And there is no great man who can make the struggle for us. It's up to us to do it. Yeah. Each one in their own way, but each one reaching out so that it's not just a me, it's a we, and expanding that we is part of the job of organizing.
Yeah. They say the difference between illness and wellness is the difference between I and we.
Absolutely. And the difference, I often think the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And it's very important that we frame it in those kind of ethical terms.
Yeah. So we're talking about vision and North Star. In your book, Demand the Impossible, Bill, you talk about the role of the imagination, the radical imagination, and you have a quote that you say, our radical imaginations are tenacious. They doggedly refuse to go quietly into the dark, dark night. When significant numbers of people are encouraged to pursue their curiosity and passion, when another world seems not only desirable to a large enough group, but also possible, the status quo becomes suddenly unbearable and revolution is in the air.
So I like that. I said that. Wow.
You said that. You said that, my man. So I'm wondering if you could say more about the role of the imagination.
Well, I think part of our job as thinkers, as actors, as teachers, as organizers, is to nourish and expand the radical imagination. And what I mean by that, I want to make a distinction again, going back to Anadea's point about individualism. I want to make a distinction between imagination as a free-floating aspect of everyone's life to something that my mentor Maxine Green called the social imagination, because Maxine made a distinction, and she often said it took a hell of an imagination to imagine Auschwitz. You know, that somebody thought of that, and that was thinking of a monstrous kind of quality. But if we want to create an imagination that can envision a better world, that can take steps towards that better world, then I think we have to not only nourish it, but show through a lot of different kinds of actions and media and so on, that another world is possible. The world as such is right in front of us, but a world that could be or should be has to be articulated and re-articulated, reimagined again and again. That's part of why I'm a huge believer in imaginative literature and in art. I think that we, you know, what art does is it transports us. And I see it in my grandkids, I see it in my students. You know, it makes us think of other people as three-dimensional, just like ourselves. You know, you encounter other people in fiction, and it disorients you from believing that your narcissistic view is the only view there is. You know, I mean, in my new book, I write a bit about this idea that, you know, you wake up every morning and you're a little grouchy, you make toast and tea, and you get on the road, and you're kind of constructing a world from the moment you wake up. That's my world. It's my world. It's good for me. I'm the narrator of my world. I'm the expert of my world. I'm the person who sees everything the way it actually is. And I often say this about teachers in classrooms. You know, the idea that there's one true story of classroom life and 30 misinterpretations has to be false. There are 31 true stories of classroom life, and being a little humble is an important part of that. But I think, you know, I think that the normal narcissism, when we see even the language, my grandchild, my wife, my car, it's all, that's all we, I think of my birth family. So I'll just narrate my birth family very quickly. My mother was a Pollyanna. My father was a workaholic. One of my brothers was an alcoholic. One of my brothers, okay, I'll stop there to stop being a complete idiot. Now, nobody in my family would narrate the story that way. Nobody would say, hi, I'm Bill's brother. He's so insightful, and I'm a bit of an alcoholic. You know, I mean, what in the world does that mean? You know, but if you do take that to the extreme, that's where fascism, totalitarianism, autocracy lies. The idea that my view is the universal view, and I see the world whole. But it's obviously a fantasy. I think imaginative literature can get you off your narcissistic high horse.
Wow. So talking about narcissism and talking about education and talking about Donald Trump and the cultural trance that has fallen in lockstep with him of millions and millions of people, how can education, is that a failure of education, that people cannot think with a critical mind and see what's going on and take action? Is that in education? How are you addressing that?
Well, look, I think it is a failure of education, but I don't want education to be confined to the classroom. Education is the media, education is the street, education is TV, education is everything. So yes, it's a failure of education. I mean, one of the things, as you know, when you travel outside the United States, we are looked upon with a certain amount of pity because we have no sense of history and no sense of geography. And you talk about absolute failures in the American educational system. Nobody knows where we are or who we are. And it's a staggering, and then there are certain people, Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, who want to encode that in law. We want you to be stupid. And that's all the more reason that we should rise up and refuse to be stupid, you know? But I think, yes, that we are in a world of trouble around the kind of not only individualism, but the cult of personality, the idea that I'll follow a leader right into the gates of hell. And I think that this fever can break. And when it breaks, we will be astonished at that it ever existed. We've had situations before. On the other hand, I don't want to underestimate the power of white supremacy. There's always been a base for white supremacy, and it could go away. And it's our job to push that rock up the hill, to try, to fail, to try again, to fail better. I am going to have to go momentarily. So if you have a last word, I would love that.
Michael, I'll leave you to that.
Somebody just poked their head in here and they're going to kick me out.
Yeah. Okay. What would you say does it mean to be human right now?
I think that's one of the great questions. And I think it's a question you should pose to your audience. I pose it to my students all the time. And the question is, what does it mean to be human in the 21st century, looking at the overlapping crises that we have been talking about? What does it mean to be human and to stand up for humanity in that moment? The other thing I think we should all be asking, this is Grace Lee Boggs's fundamental question: where are we on the clock of the universe? What is required of us? And I think that, as I said earlier, the rhythm of activism is to open your eyes and pay attention and be astonished and act in doubt. That's what I think it means to be human, to be curious, to be guided by wanting to know the next thing, not satisfied that you know everything, and not to be dogmatic or orthodox, but to always be asking the next question and finding the next friend and the next person to talk to. You started with Obama, and I argued again and again during that period that it's not a sin that he has many, many people that he talks to from all over the political spectrum. In fact, in a robust democracy, that's actually considered a virtue. And so I think we should talk to our neighbors, talk to strangers, get engaged in, not in battles, but in conversations where in dialogue. And the essence of dialogue is to speak with the possibility of being heard, but to listen with the possibility of being changed. And just listening can change me every day. I can find nuances I never thought of. I think that's important. If you're not curious, you are falling into dogma. If you fall into dogma, you're an easy target for autocracy and authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
I feel changed just by listening to you. I feel my heart lifting with possibility. I could listen to you for hours.
Well, let's do it again. Let's do it again.
Uplifting.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, I'll write to Bill. But thank you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, your students
and certainly when the new book comes out, I would love to come and spend a couple hours with you guys.
Okay. Yeah.
Wonderful. Sure. Wonderful. We'd have you on again in a heartbeat, and I'm sure our listeners would. And this goes out to many people after the fact. Our last one got at least 2,500 views at the last check. Even though there's not a lot of people on the call, it goes out widely. And you are an utter inspiration.
Well, let's stay in touch and let's inspire one another and everyone we touch. Keep rising and keep the light flowing.
That's what we have to do. This time is now.
Thank you so much.
All right. Happy holidays.
Have a good rest of the year. Okay. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you again. Oh, we're still here. So Bill had to leave. People are still on, they're leaving. But for those still here, we'll be back January 9th with our next guest, the filmmaker Marin Poitras, who has a new documentary film called Finding the Money. And it ties in well with what Bill was saying about creating a society that works for all, because that is the documentary really goes into the nuts and bolts and goes into the weeds about how we can create that society for all, and that the money is there to do that. So we look forward to it.
I'd also like to say we have a new website. We're still working out some of the kinks in it. So there's a few things that are irregular, but it's up, and it's Voices for the Future, not of, voicesforthefuture.org. And it has the archives of every talk we've done. And Michael and I have picked our 9 favorites so far, although this one we just did is going to be one of my top favorites. So we'll have to boot somebody. But you can watch other interviews we've done and keep track of what's coming up. After January, in February, we'll have Barb Chambliss, who talks about women peacemakers. from all over the world, and that will be inspiring. And we've got some pending for March and April and May.
Yeah, I already got, I think through May. We're Mark Nico will be back somewhere in the spring too.
And he's
Okay.
just such a poet's soul. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Happy
Happy
holidays.
holidays. We'll see you next year.
Okay, bye.